As we sit right now in the United States, approximately 60% of the population has had at least their first dose of the COVID vaccine. Also, around 35% of the United States population has antibodies from previous exposure to the illness, which means we are getting closer and closer to a world within the United States where COVID has changed. It is no longer going to be the crushing pandemic that we lived through in 2020. It is going to be a manageable disease that allows society to begin getting back to normal. And I believe by the end of 2021, barring a radical mutation of the virus, we'll look back to normal. But you compare that to what's going on in India. India is being absolutely crushed right now by a COVID surge like nothing we've ever seen in the world. They're about to dwarf what we witnessed here in America last year. And it is a humanitarian crisis like something we haven't seen in years. And if they don't get it under control, like something we haven't seen in a generation. And it's against this backdrop that businesses have to figure out how on earth do they participate in world events. I know I take this topic very seriously at Miva. Leaders are constantly trying to apply principles in a conflicted world, where in one part of the world, the U.S. is coming out of the pandemic, hopefully, and another part of the world is getting in far deeper into the pandemic. And you have to make decisions that can let you straddle that in both ways. So this past week, there was a major meltdown in tech culture that was not nearly as serious as anything around the pandemic. In fact, it impacted a little company with 58 employees, and I wanted to talk about it. Jason Fried, founder and CEO of Basecamp, posted a statement last Monday. His company would be going apolitical going forward, internally and publicly, which is very odd because Jason is notorious, as is his partner David, for being on Twitter, writing articles, and gaining press for being very outspoken politically. They've been involved in everything from the antitrust issues around Apple's App Store to the Chicago mayor's race to diversity within their own company. But yet he touched on important issues. Does every business need to create a social impact, or is a business's best contributions the product it makes? Should workers feel free to debate and critique, or is it only about the work? Which is more valuable, team decision-making or personal responsibility? Those are all really great questions that need to be explored, and any leader worth their salt is going to explore them. And then, of course, is Twitter real life, or is it just some bizarre echo chamber that we should mostly ignore? The real question here is, what were Jason's real motivations? Was this good leadership or not? I'll explore these questions and more in this episode. Welcome to Dragon Proof. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Basecamp, let's talk about it. Who is Jason Fried? What is Basecamp? Well, Jason Fried is one of the greatest marketers of this generation. Him and his partner David built Basecamp, a $40 million a year recurring revenue SaaS company that does project management and communication software with only 58 employees. Knowing what it takes to scale a company, I can only offer praise and total admiration for what they've achieved. Miva was a Basecamp customer from, I think, 2009 to about 2019. They ultimately got rid of a feature that we needed, so we switched out, but it wasn't a political decision in the slightest. Basecamp started in 1999. They sold a stake to Jeff Bezos in 2006, and the kind of modern generation of the product started in 2014. They have 3.5 million users. And most importantly, Jason himself, what makes him a great marketer is that he's famous, literally famous in the tech world at least, but as an author, for being very outspoken. He writes books about work-life balance manifestos. I've read one of his books, Rework, and it's a great book. Jason doesn't know me, but I've certainly followed Jason for most of my time at Miva, and he's a fascinating guy, which makes this whole controversy all the more interesting, and we'll get into that here in a second. But here's what he said. He wrote a memo that not only that, he published publicly before announcing to his internal staff, which I think is, I don't know, there's something there that belies what's really going on, and I don't know the inner workings of Basecamp. But he wrote a memo that said, in a blog post on their blog, no more internal political debate unless it's on a private channel. So if they're using Slack, which I assume they are, you can't just do it in their open channel, and no political content in social media under the Basecamp name. They were also ending paternalistic benefits, things like gym memberships and stuff like that, committee decision-making, 360 peer reviews, and all of this was bundled in kind of a weird way. Most of the things he touched on, I agree with in some format or other, but what did they have to do with political content? And did it make any sense to put it in this one blog post? Or were they really just sweeping concerns under a rug? They were annoyed. They didn't want to deal with this anymore. They're wildly successful. They don't need this hassle. I've certainly woken up with days like that. I just luckily have never written a blog about it or not as of yet done a podcast about it. And fundamentally, they're not a social impact company. Their mission focus is product only, which if you take all the points he made in his blog post at face value, it sounds valid, especially at first glance. But I think context is critical. And overall, yeah, I think the best contribution a company can make is generally to make a great product. What are most companies adding to a debate with non-expert commentary? There are PhDs out there who study immigration, and if Miva posts an opinion about migrants crossing the border, am I helping? Are we adding anything that hasn't already been discussed? Or should that really be to people who do that for a living? That doesn't mean we don't have opinions, but a company needs to be careful with when they weigh in. With that said, it's impossible to be apolitical. The question is focal length. If a company takes no political stance, then silence is complicit. And is there a line between humanitarian issues and ideological stands? To me, at least personally, it's sad that the statement Black Lives Matter is a political statement. It shouldn't be. People who have grown up of color fear for their life in a way that's disproportionate to someone who's white. And that shouldn't be a political issue. If you're pro-mask, that's literally just a public health issue. Pro-vaccination specifically for COVID, but in general, a public health issue. Voting rights, just civics issues. Those things shouldn't be political. They currently are in our bizarro country right now. Where is the line? What should a company talk about? How far should we go? And I wrestle with how much political opinion to share in podcast on Miva. But the real question to me is, what's really going on here? And I'll give you a hint. I don't think it has much, if anything, to do with the company sharing political opinions or not. This whole thing started, the way it first came to my attention is Chris, the producer of Dragon Proof, sent me a link to the Twitter thread about this. And it was nothing short of a firestorm on Twitter. At that point, I don't think there had been any major press, but this was, a little over a week ago. The gist of the initial tweets were that Jason Fried was silencing dissent because it got uncomfortable. As more has come out, that appears like that may exactly be what's going on. I will never totally be in Jason's mind, but that's certainly plausible. I think the deepest tweets, and it's hard for 256 characters to get super deep, but the deepest tweets really touched on Jason is a person of privilege, extreme privilege. Not only is he a white male, so he's got some natural privilege in our society, but he's wildly financially successful. He is the co-owner of a company that does $40 million in recurring revenue with 58 employees. I understand SaaS economics enough to know that Jason doesn't have to work if he doesn't want to. Unless he's got like a Nick Cage level spending problem. And that turned into a bunch of tech reporting. He ended up on The Verge and on TechCrunch and everywhere, which I would normally say was his intent, although this time I'm not so sure. And what happens next is tens of thousands of people reply on Twitter, jumping on this blog post and attacking Basecamp's position. Although that brings up a totally different question and possibly a different podcast episode. Does it even matter what people on Twitter say? Twitter has a specific bend, and I wouldn't say it's representative of society as a whole. And oftentimes people in our society get hung up on Twitter when they shouldn't. Not to discount Twitter, it's a great product. But, just because you get attacked on Twitter doesn't mean you've done something wrong. With that, there was only a handful of people supporting his commentary. Some I doubt he wanted their support like Breitbart, but some whose support he definitely want, like Coinbase. Coinbase had made a similar political announcement last year. To me, the big difference in my mind is Coinbase has 2,000 plus employees and Basecamp has 58. It's a totally different management dynamic. And crypto, the product that Coinbase sells or is involved with, is an actual political issue. There are real political issues around crypto. Coinbase's product and Coinbase themselves have to address that and have to have guidelines for how their employees handle it. Project management software does not have that burden. So that begs the question, what was the actual event within Basecamp that triggered all of this? It was this. Starting in 2009, employees of the small company, arguably to vent some steam, had created a funny names list of customers of the Basecamp, since they have many, who had funny names. Now, of course, many of those names were European descent or of Western or white descent, but many were also of Asian and African descent. And no one today is willing to suggest what names are on the list, so we can only guess. But apparently a lot of the names were the kind of thing that would contribute to hatred against Asian people or African people. So this led to a discussion internally about something called the Pyramid of Hate. I'm not familiar with the Pyramid of Hate, But it basically suggests how small infractions at the very bottom of the pyramid can lead to very horrible things like genocide at the top. Now, again, I haven't studied the pyramid of hate. I'm not here to discuss that. But it doesn't take a big stretch of the imagination to understand how if you bully people as a society based on their name, that as time goes on, and that's a common thing in society, that you'll see other more severe reactions toward people with names like that. So David took offense to this, one of the co-founders, and he began shutting down the dialogue. He pointed out internally, but publicly internally, that one of his employees who's now against the funny names list had actually contributed to it. Okay. He went so far as to post what they contributed to the whole company, in essence, shaming them and to their peers and kind of doxing them internally. Many employees thought that was a step too far, and I agree. That's not good management. I don't know what's going on with David and Jason, but that's not good management, and it certainly suggests a culture that has bigger problems. And that's kind of how that changes my viewpoint. I think if you took the blog post at face value for a company much larger than theirs, I don't think things like, hey, limiting political discussions in the name of the company, focusing on personal responsibility, not being paternalistic, those things are all high-quality things in my mind. But it's incongruent to ask your staff to do things like read the new Jim Crow and then respond the way Jason and David did. It just doesn't add up. And that is why I believe people are suggesting that they got uncomfortable and decided to shut it down. And here's the thing. As a leader, you do have the power to shut these kind of things down. But the question is, at what cost? And should you ever use that power? In a free society, people can, and obviously in this case will, leave if you screw things up enough. The thing I can't get over is they only have 58 employees, and they did this. When you have hundreds, thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, you need guidelines to keep everyone rowing in the same direction. But at the human scale they operate at with only 58 employees, it's hard not to just see this as something they just didn't want to deal with anymore. If you remember that movie, Bruce Almighty, Jim Carrey gets a chance to be God for a second. Morgan Freeman kind of bestows this power upon him, and he can suddenly hear everyone's prayers in his head. And it's quickly overwhelming, and he realizes that that's not something he wants to deal with. He can't listen to everyone's chatter. So yes, if you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of people chattering at you, and all you're trying to do is lead a company, you need guidelines. But almost any leader can, especially two co-founders, can handle the chatter of their 56 other employees. So you have something that doesn't fundamentally pass the smell test, at least from everything we outsiders have learned. And David started by totally owning the problem of the funny names list. He said, hey, this falls right on Jason and I. But then he diluted the impact of taking responsibility by not being willing to entertain the connection between behavior like the funny names list and long-term societal ills. It doesn't mean Basecamp caused something like the Atlanta shootings, for example, by fostering a lack of acceptance of Asian names, but they refuse to see the connections of how a whole society accepting that type of behavior lays the groundwork for something like the Atlanta shootings. The connection is light, but it's real. Hank Azaria recently apologized for playing a poo all those years on The Simpsons, as he has come to grasp how in some way that helped fuel racism against people from India. And I applaud Hank for apologizing for that. No one asked him to. This was his own personal exploration of his contribution to racism in society, and he took the heat by coming out and apologizing. But if he had ended that apology with some statement about how nothing actually bad happened to Indians because he played that character, well, that apology would have been better left unsaid. And I think in this case, all of the facts from an outsider's point of view appear to be pointing to a world where David and Jason didn't want to be bothered. They wanted to get the public credit for taking stands on things like diversity and Black Lives Matter. But when someone actually asked them to do the hard work of reflecting on how, in some small, minute way, their company had contributed to some societal ills, they just shut it down as opposed to sitting in their pain. So ultimately, 1/3 of their employees took a buyout offer, including 3 senior-level employees. But with that said, this is a very hot job market. I mean, incredibly hot. If you're an employee at Basecamp, your future is bright. And they offered very generous severance packages. I believe on pure economics alone, no controversy at all. If they had just offered such severance packages, many would have taken it just for the money. They know they're going to get another job. They know they're going to get stock options at some future tech company. So if someone's going to give me 6 months salary and then I can go work somewhere else, yeah, why not? So I don't know that the third leaving has as much to do with the political issues as it does with the monetary issues. The other rumor on the street is that many employees found out about the change to things like pay and benefits either via Twitter or the blog post, which is to say the least, not how you should communicate personnel choices, especially in a company of 58 employees. There's something rotten in Denmark when it comes to this whole story. Like, you could have called all 58 employees and then published the blog post. It's so bizarre. And I think the questions they brought up in the blog post, should tech have an idealistic role in society, or internal workings of a company and democracy? Those are valid questions. And no, tech doesn't have to be idealistic. The purpose of tech, I would say the purpose of Apple is to make 4 things. Apple makes iPhones, Macs, iPads, and the ecosystem that goes with it. But with that said, Apple supports Project Red. They support curbing global emissions. They're trying to be carbon neutral. They offer a plan where you can donate to charities and they'll match your donation. They're able to be focused on their product while making the world a better place. Now, with that said, I promise you Tim Cook doesn't make decisions by having the employees vote. Tim Cook is a leader. He understands that leading a company does not function like a democracy. But, and this is the big but, because it's not a democracy, you have to listen. And sometimes your employees are going to reflect things to you don't want to hear. And what you do is sit there and absorb it and reflect upon it. If you regurgitate based on that immediately, you are likely making a mistake. You can argue that much of leadership is threading the needle, taking principles and applying them to real daily life choices. And to me, that is a fundamental dragon-proof concept. And here's my final thoughts on the difference between a mission-focused company and a social impact company. I believe that most companies should be mission-focused. It's not our job to save the world. It's our job to make products. That's why we created these companies. And external social issues do impact our workers and our customers in many ways. So how do you balance that action? And most importantly, you have to have self-awareness about when you're balancing that action and thinking things through versus silencing debate because it makes you uncomfortable. So at first, when I read the blog post, I thought Jason was trying to lower the temperature in the room, much like Joe Biden was when he first got inaugurated. Just lower the temperature. We all need to lower the temperature. And I think from that perspective, his blog post was dead on. But as more and more information came out, it seemed like he wasn't necessarily trying to lower the temperature. He was trying to shut down a discussion. And those are 2 totally different things. You as a leader can provide principled leadership to allow people to discuss meaningful, important, and challenging topics while keeping the temperature lowered. But if you just try to shut it down, you're going to get a different response. And so ultimately the response at Basecamp is employees are protesting and quitting. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. Some I just talked about, like the economic benefits. Some, if you read the Verge article that explains what really happened behind the scenes, there's sort of this notion that Basecamp's sole purpose for existence is just for David and Jason's whims. If their employees think that, I don't know if that's true, but if their employees think that, that's a culture that's going to have problems. And like I said at the top, we're still very much embroiled in a major global crisis. COVID hasn't gone away on top of all the other crises we have in this world. But, and I don't want to make light of crises, we will always have crises. The whole reason leadership matters is because the world is a thing of crisis. There are great things in the world. There are wonderful things in the world. But the point of leadership is to help people, to marshal people through crisis. And what we do and say matters. We don't exist independently in the world, just like the US and India right now. Ultimately, as the owner of a private business, you have to make decisions you can stand behind and that your team will respect. These are my thoughts for now. We'll keep discussing these things on Dragonproof. Thank you and goodbye.